So in this video, I want to discuss with you how we think about sustainability and climate change, because how we comprehend a given situation is really key to whether or not and how we might go about addressing it. With a better understanding of human cognition, we can really see exactly how complicated the issue of sustainability is, and subsequently understand better that it's rarely due to a moral failing that people do little to address the issue, and more about how our cognitive architecture is put together, and then how that affects our ability to engage or not engage in a given action. So the first point that I want to make is recognizing and accepting that human awareness is profoundly limited. We can hold a limited amount of information in memory and in our awareness for a limited time. We're very prone to distraction, and we often miss pretty much anything that we are not expressly looking for. And so to illustrate this point, what I want to do is show you a quick video, and I want you to watch the video. I'm going to appear right here, and I want you to pay attention to how many times the team in white passes the basketball. Count that number of times, and we'll see what you get. Just try and pay close attention. So, did you notice the gorilla? So this experiment was originally designed to test what we call change blindness or selective attention. But this same limitation can really illustrate how we might think about climate change and sustainability. Maybe unless you live in a coastal area that's prone to flooding, you probably don't think about whole neighborhoods that we've already lost along the eastern and Gulf Coast to sea level rise. Maybe you haven't thought about the Great Horn now being pressed into smaller and smaller stands of old growth forests, making it harder and harder to find mates and rear young. You haven't thought about the starving polar bears in the Arctic, homeless orangutans in Borneo, or mountain lions trying to outrun wildfires in the Western United States. You likely haven't thought about this and many other issues facing our planet, because unless they're right in your face or happening in your own backyard, you don't notice them. We call this psychological distance. In some ways, creating psychological distance is necessary for maintaining our own kind of sanity. We can only pay attention to so many things at once. To think about everything going wrong would be overwhelming. It would be paralyzing to us. So we put some space between ourselves and the things that we find it difficult to swallow. It's also well established that when the majority of people think about climate change, they think of something that's going to happen to someone else and someplace else and at a later date. And unfortunately, we're really fast losing the runway. And it's here, us, and right now that we need to be attending to. So are we just a foolish, selfish primate? Yes and no. We tend to be pretty poor statisticians of our experience. However, we think that we're really good at making these sorts of estimates about when and how certain things are going to happen. We tend to pay close attention and overestimate the severity of immediate threats, and we tend to underestimate the severity of long-term threats. The easier the threat is to comprehend, the more likely we are to consider it. So for example, we might overestimate the threat of a terrorist attack, but we might fail to recognize that we're much more likely to die in a shark attack. We likely evolved this capacity to focus on and overestimate immediate threats because of their immediate potential to affect our survival. If you think of it this way, for about 99.9% of human evolution, we've had no real need to think more than 2 to 72 hours into the future. And for most of that time, our actions have had little effect on that future. And so because this lack of ramifications, we haven't really needed to have sort of a big time scale to the way in which our cognition operates. But now we have lots of effects on our future, but we're deficient in the cognitive architecture to attend to and effectively manage them. As a further example of thinking about how this architecture works, our brain devotes about 5 times more processing power to locating and identifying patterns that we've already seen before. So noticing and categorizing things that we know compared to searching for and processing novel visual patterns and information. So you can think of it as very much us being kind of creatures of mental habit. We tend to focus on the familiar. We tend to look for the familiar. And when we find things that are new, we tend to even categorize them as being familiar. We don't really think far into the future, and we have a hard time paying attention to begin with. And then again, that works okay for things that are in front of our face, but sustainability and climate change are very much not in front of our face. They're happening on a global level, but we're not a global thinker. So what about rewards and dangers? Don't we consider long-term threats dangerous? Don't scientists and activists tell us about considering long-term effects in climate change? Shouldn't we be trying to be more sustainable now and show us that we can make a better future? Can't we become more aware? Can't we sort of think our way beyond these processes? Don't we think it's serious enough? I guess is one way to consider it. Well, enter a new concept. This concept is called hyperbolic discounting. It's this tendency to forego long-term rewards for more immediate rewards. It developed out of an area of psychology that crosses over into economics called behavioral economics to look at how people make decisions. And this and other research related to it really showed that humans are not rational thinkers, even though much of our economic theory is based on rational decision making. Let's say I offer you $50 now or $100 next month. Which option do you take? Maybe most of you would say, well, I'll take the $50 now. Or some of you saying, well, no, I'll wait and I'll take $100 next month. Actually, about 60% of people choose to take the $50 now. That doesn't really make sense because you can get double that if you just wait a month. When asked to explain themselves, they tend to cite a variety of different justifications. And what we're really doing when we're making those sorts of justifications is actually rearranging a series of assumptions and biases about why taking half the amount promised is a better deal when objectively looking at it, it isn't. We see this happen all the time in relation to climate disasters. Private citizens who can pay somewhere around maybe $5,000 to prepare for and evacuate from a hurricane. So this is doing things like buying fuel, a generator, food, water, maybe paying for hotels where you're staying out of the city where you live. If you're a business owner, you're going to pay even more money than that. And this is on top of the required kinds of flood or hurricane insurance, which are sometimes federally even mandated for people to purchase when living in flood-prone or hurricane-prone areas. That can cost another $1,000 to $2,000 annually or more. So it might seem like a no-brainer to ask coastal residents in areas that are prone to flooding and hurricanes to invest in, say, a small tax, maybe $1 or $2 per person per month, which is something that's been put forth in parts of Louisiana and Florida. And this money would then be used to construct levees and flood mitigation measures to prevent damage to homes and businesses. However, consistently, citizens in flood-prone areas see the immediate loss due to a negligible increase in taxes, that's $1 or $2 per person per month, as being more aversive than the exponentially greater cost of a possible and now probable evacuation costing them somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $7,000. This was acutely visible, this kind of discounting process or failure to see that spending some now or taking a smaller option now versus later is a bad idea, was really visible in the Texas winter storms of 2021. And this cost nearly 1,000 lives and close to $100 billion in infrastructure damage. The Texas power grid in these storms failed for really two reasons. One was that no one ever thought it was going to get that cold or snow that much in Texas. And so the power grid didn't need to be prepared for that sort of everyone turning on their heat at the same time. The second part was that the cost to the state and private agencies to winterize those power systems was really seen as being too expensive given the low likelihood of a catastrophic weather event. So we can see in this instance, do you want to save money now, or do you want to lose a lot of money later? I mean, the answer being like, well, we want to save it now, even though it's a small amount. In some ways, it's kind of sad because it's sort of like the old saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And maybe we'll continue to say that because of our problems with making estimations and problems with hyperbolic discounting, that until there are no more birds and no more bushes left, we're going to continue to make this mistake until we decide to do otherwise. Here's some evolutionary explanations for our behavior and maybe lack thereof sometimes in relation to sustainability. Evolutionary biologists assume that when we make decisions that we're always engaging in some level, in some kind of form of cost-benefit analysis. And that cost-benefit analysis is whether or not we're going to be able to effectively procreate and pass on our genes. That is, are we going to be able to survive? Because that's what evolution is all about, really, is survival of organisms over time. So this cost-benefit analysis is about survival, and we can model this analysis looking at organismic behavior in large groups. The evolutionary biologist R.D. Hamilton went so far as to actually construct a mathematical equation to explain how we assess and make sense of what we call an indirect fitness benefit, or basically under what circumstances we tend to act or help one another. This equation is R times B minus C. It has to be greater than 0. R is the relatedness or the connection between organisms. B is the benefit of the action that's being carried out minus the cost or the cost of fitness, right? The potential harm to survival that might face the actor. This has to be greater than 0. So in other words, we tend to do more costly things for closer relatives, right? Because R times B is going to be greater than C, which means it's going to be greater than 0. We do this in order to justify, in a sense, why we would sacrifice for strangers and different others, or why we would choose not to sacrifice for strangers and different others. Related to this, there's this idea of what's called Dunbar's number, the concept that we're really only capable of maintaining close relationships with about 150 other people. Beyond that, it becomes really difficult to build associations, to form common goals, and to trust. And if we add to that, that we don't really seem to be too concerned about people who share or people who are more than 2 generations behind or ahead of us. So we tend to focus on our grandparents, our parents, ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. In terms of who we're overall worried about in terms of survival and in terms of how they're doing. After all, we really only share about 25% of our genes with those people. And once we lose fewer than that, it's basically like having your second cousin ask you to help move apartments for a couple slices of pizza and some cheap beer. This would be fine in our hunter-gatherer past, but it makes tackling complex global issues like climate change really difficult. Okay. So evolutionary and cognitive psychology don't have a ton of good news when it comes to promoting sustainability and dealing with climate disaster. But that doesn't mean we're lost. It does mean that we need to think differently about how we approach and frame the issues. If we can't think big, long-term, and in large groups, we have to keep it small, now, and local, because that's how our brains are built. And that's exactly what we see working when it comes to promoting sustainability. The endowment effect shows that when we work in small groups to solve problems, we tend to take greater ownership of those solutions. We value it more because it's ours. We did it. Working in this sort of space, we also can promote healthy social comparison, where we look around us to kind of gauge how to behave. And if we see our fellow community members doing good, we want to do good too. We know this from social psychology. Here's a great example. There's a filmmaking company called Exposure Labs. They specialize in making films about environmental activism and raising awareness about environmental issues. They regularly organize community showings of their films to bring together local grassroots environmental groups. And beyond watching the films, Exposure Labs also goes so far as to facilitate discussions with community stakeholders and help them in setting actionable goals to solve their local environmental issues. The result is really creative thinking and ownership of problems and possible solutions, and communal motivation for ongoing change. So after the movie's over, the community continues to move forward with their projects. This all sounds pretty cool, right? Maybe we can add a little healthy competition to promote even more motivation. Some power companies send periodic mailings to their customers telling them how they stack up against their neighbors with regards to their electrical usage. They ask questions like, are you using more or less than the other people around you? And can you make smarter choices and use less? And they give you a nice bar graph that shows you kind of how your house is performing against the houses around you. And don't you want to win? I mean, isn't that a positive way of framing sort of the goal of trying to reduce and live more sustainably? You'll probably notice, and you probably know this from your own experience, that it's much easier to be motivated by positive rewards of winning as opposed to the negative experience of punishment. Psychologists refer to this as what's called the framing effect. And it's one area where many messages about climate change and sustainability go wrong. We tend to gravitate towards the positive and away from the negative. And so when we hear troubling statistics about climate change, or are chastised for not living more sustainably, instead of feeling some positive sense of guilt to act, most people shut down or ignore the message. Positive messages that highlight a person's capacity for agency, their capability, and their connections are often the best. They make us feel like we're choosing to do something positive and that we share in that experience with liked others. So there are really multiple processes at work here. On the one hand, we have the way in which the framing a message affects how it is heard by the listener, and in another way, how they subsequently react to that message. The final concept I want to illustrate for you is why this reactivity to different messages occurs. It's called cognitive dissonance. Maybe it's a term that you've heard of before. It gets talked about a lot in politics and why people make certain political decisions or have particular kinds of attitudes. And it's that we all like to have our behavior match our attitudes. And most people would say that they act in accordance with their beliefs. But what happens if your beliefs and your actions don't match, or the information that you think is true turns out to not be true? And you might think that if people hear a message that their actions of, let's do things like driving cars or getting packages in the mail every other day or buying food shipped from other parts of the globe, taking long flights to go on vacation, is adding too much carbon to the atmosphere, is unsustainable and is seriously harming the health of the planet, that they would immediately change their behavior. But we don't. We almost ignore it, and we justify our actions by altering how we think about them. We blame others. We maybe say it's only a small part of the problem. This is what cognitive dissonance is. It's changing our attitudes rather than our behavior to fit our behavior, because thinking differently is a lot easier than actually acting differently. Acting differently requires an honest willingness to examine our attitudes and our actions in relation to our reality, and then changing appropriately to live in line with our values. So if there's an antidote to cognitive dissonance, it's the practice of discernment. So hopefully this video has helped you see some of the limitations of human cognition, but that knowing these limitations, we can consider more carefully how we work to change attitudes and promote sustainable behavior. So in the next video, I'm going to describe to you just that, different strategies for motivating sustainable behavior change. Thanks.